we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Hello and welcome to another episode of Containers from the Couch. I'm Justin Garrison. With me today, I have two new people to the show. Welcome, Sai. Say hello.
Hey everyone, happy to be here.
And if you haven't been watching the Containers from the Couch channel, Sai's been doing some awesome whiteboard videos or lightboard videos about all sorts of different topics, different explainers on a ton of different things. So if you have more ideas that you want Sai to do, drop a comment because we also want to hear about that. Sai's pushing those out pretty much every week, which is awesome. And today we also have Luke from Fairwinds Ops. Thanks for joining, Luke.
Hey everyone, happy to be here.
And today we want to talk about Helm charts in Kubernetes. Helm charts are, Helm itself is an amazing tool that if you've been along the journey of Helm, it has gone through many iterations of basically being a thing that merged a bunch of YAML on your local machine and then pushed it all out to the server, and then being something with a tiller that ran inside the cluster where you just pushed the raw YAML and it did all that on the server side. And now it does something sort of in between with controllers and CRDs and local tool that is way more secure, and I love it, but it's still packages. It's still things you run in your cluster that are sometimes difficult. Sai, do you have experience with Helm?
Yeah, absolutely. There's honestly one thing that I can say I am super glad about getting past. It's the age of Helm version 2 with the tiller. It was just a huge gaping security risk. It just, if you got access to the permissions that tiller had, you had basically excessive permissions in the cluster. So I'm really glad the direction that Helm has gone. And I think as the community is centered around, GitOps and kind of pulling more and more into the Kubernetes ecosystem and having Kubernetes itself manage not just application deployment, but infrastructure management, Helm plays this, I think, critical role. And I think it's gotten a lot of traction in the community. So I think I'm really excited for today's session. Luke, maybe I can pass it to you and maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've been doing with Helm over the years.
Yeah, definitely. So here to talk about a few of our tools, Reckoner, Nova, and Pluto. Reckoner is, so a lot of companies will have a wrapper around Helm to help deploy a lot of things at once. Maybe you want to use it as a infrastructure as code sort of thing where you're storing everything in Git, and then you need something else to do all the various deployments. And that's kind of the hole that Reckoner is filling there, at least for us and for quite a few folks that use our open source there. So at a high level, it revolves around this idea of a course file. So it's very in the Kubernetes spirit of a water theme. We have Reckoner plot to plot your course, and it essentially stores a variety of Helm values to pass into the various charts you want to install as releases in your cluster, with a few other nice things that we'll go over.
Absolutely. And Luke, I think you mentioned one thing about Reckoner being kind of this declarative approach. And I'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit more, because nowadays I feel like a declarative.
Uh-oh, Sai.
Well, I can maybe pick up a little bit there. I don't know where the question was going fully, but yeah, it is a declarative approach. You put in your course file what you want to end up in the cluster. When you run Reckoner, it will make it so, whether that is the case currently or not. And if you want to compare it to something like Terraform, that is kind of like Terraform, but the state is held in Helm. Like Helm kind of manages your state for it. Like the Helm releases are the state. And then if we do have a reckoner diff command as well, which is super useful to kind of show what will change on the resources when you install.
So how is Reckoner different than Helm lock, like the lock files that people, I know that was a popular tool for a little while where you basically make your Helm lock file that could do a lot of the stuff declaratively, but had kind of this sort of like Python pip lock sort of format. How is Reckoner different than that? That was one of the questions that I was curious about.
Okay, so I'll be honest with you. I'm not super familiar with Helm lock, but I know that Helm file is also another similar.
That's the one I meant.
tool.
Sorry. I'm
Okay.
throwing you off, saying wrong words.
And I also haven't used that too much, but I've looked at their code a little, and I do think they're comparable. We've started to support a little bit of namespace management, so I don't know all their features, so I don't know where we are slightly different, but we do offer some namespace management features. So Helm in olden days, I don't think would create namespaces for you. That is a feature that it will do for you now when you pass in a certain argument. But with Reckoner, we still rely on Reckoner to do that. Under the hood, we don't necessarily rely on the Helm implementation of it always. Hey, Sai.
Hey, I'm going to blame that one on the demo gods. Of course, my first time on a Containers from the Couch live stream, my power just went out, so the browser had to restart.
Wow.
So I'm back.
That's a pretty dramatic way to steal the couch. I see that you had to switch locations. So you're like, I want the couch, but I'm going to move you back. There you go.
There we go.
We want Luke on the couch today. We were just going over Helm files. And so Reckoner, in this case, you have Reckoner can create namespaces for you. But in both cases, they're still fairly declarative. They can manage multiple charts at the same time. It kind of more is like a meta package almost, right? Where it's like my application might have multiple dependencies, and Helm has dependent charts. So I could say if I want to deploy my web app and I need Redis or something else, I can have those as dependent charts. But those are all kind of tied. Like if you don't want to fork the chart itself, you might want to use the individual pieces and use your own versions or upgrade them separately, right? Like that's the main benefit here with Reckoner is you have a little more control over that.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up because part of my my demo course file kind of will show that actually using Goldilocks, which was a recent feature on the show. But yeah, to get back, we also in the course file keep track of repositories to keep kind of every time you run a Reckoner command, it'll keep the repository list up to date. So it's kind of just a command to replace all your Helm commands so that you can kind of just run one thing to get things out there in the cluster and upgrade them. So yeah,
cool. And I know, like for myself, my historical usage of Helm was always like find the chart I wanted, but it wouldn't have everything I needed, right? It would either had variables that weren't there, or I want a different version of something. So I'd fork that internally. I would change the things I want. I would write my own values, and then I would deploy it, and I would never upgrade it again. And that was a problem because then it was just like this static thing that I like, oh, I need to merge in the changes. I need to test all this stuff. And that was like a week of work to figure out like all the changes upstream, all of the dependencies, everything else, and say like, where's the value for me was initially packaging and getting it out there. And now this maintenance is actually more of a burden. And I'm assuming that Reckoner can help in a lot of those ways to help that maintenance and help give you some of that assurances of like, hey, this isn't going to change unless you want it to, but it should be hopefully easier to get things pushed out and changed in a reasonable way.
Right. Yeah. Now, Reckoner Diff is another command I think that is like one of my favorite features that got added back in the day, and we've iterated on it more. But you run that against the chart that you have in your course file with presumably some changes in your course file because you're updating something, a value, or maybe a new version. And Reckoner Diff will grab the Helm, basically runs Helm manifest on a release to spit out the YAML, and then do a diff on the Helm template and report only what will change. It looks a little bit like a Git diff on what will change in your cluster when you try to upgrade.
Cool. So Luke, on that aspect, I'd love to kind of understand, the idempotency features that Reckoner might be bringing to the table here. And for our viewers, idempotency, basically, it's the fact that you can run a command multiple times and not necessarily expect it to change the result from the first time you ran it. which is, by the way, great for config drift because you can continuously run this command, identify if your configuration no longer matches the real state of the world. So look, I'd kind of love to understand, how does Reckoner manage the idempotency of maybe the templates underneath it? I know to some extent the templates themselves need to be idempotent. For example, if you're randomizing a cluster name and you run it multiple times, it's going to create multiple clusters. But as far as kind of state management and that kind of thing, is there something Reckoner is doing to kind of help users out?
So it's not necessarily doing anything extra over Helm in that regard, because Helm, it is still kind of up to chart maintainers to kind of do the right thing. Reckoner's there to help you at least see what's going to happen and then do that thing, hopefully.
Right.
But it's still a lot of the idempotency is up to chart maintainers and stuff like that. So because I think it was when your power went out, the state is essentially like the release, the Helm release. So Reckoner will treat that as like its source of truth for state. So and rely on Helm to actually make the change itself.
Should we jump into it? I think that we can understand a lot of this by also showing it off. So let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah. Cool. So we're here at the docs page. So the GitHub links that were sent out will also link into this. This is like our more verbose documentation. So let's start at the beginning. So you'll see here, I want to point this out, that a lot of this documentation is also going to change. Traditionally has been a Python tool, and anyone that's worked with Python can understand that it can be difficult to distribute Python CLI tools sometimes. And even internally here at Fairwinds, we have engineers that will use Mac, Linux, Windows. We don't want to tell anyone they have to use a Mac just because a developer developed on a Mac. So to ease that, we did come to the conclusion finally that it would benefit us to rewrite this, and we have rewritten in Go. And what I will I
was hoping for Bash, but Go is a good choice.
Yeah, I know. we aren't fast enough to get to Rust either. So we'll see.
But then later you can rewrite it in Rust, and then you get a blog post about it, right? Like that's the
right.
benefit.
That's right. That's right. So some of this documentation will be changing with that upcoming release. So today I will be using a release candidate of our Go implementation, though. So yeah. So we'll jump down to the usage. So like I mentioned before, course file is, for better or worse, another YAML file that you will be looking at. So we have a lot of these top level keys, and charts is the one that is where you actually define everything you want to install. And I will point out also that our course version of our spec of our file is changing in this major release a little bit, because we realized probably too late that charts was not a great name, because really we're defining releases, not charts in our section there.
And a release being a chart and a version, right? I mean, that's like that coupling, that tuple of two things. It's like, actually, we want to be more specific.
Yeah, precisely. So another cool feature are hooks. So you can have top level hooks that every time you run Reckoner plot, this thing also happens. So if you have, say you have a secret that you want to store like in an encrypted file, you could run a hook, like say it's with SOPs. You could run a hook to decrypt and push that secret to the cluster without having to store that information in plain text in your course file. And then there are also release level hooks that are, in each individual release section, you can add a hook section. Repositories I'll go over when I do my demo a bit, just to see that structure, but that's where you manage all the various repositories you'll pull from. Minimum versions is a way to set like your default or your minimum Helm and Reckoner version. So which points out that we actually do shell out to Helm in here. We don't pull in Helm packages from Go. We decided that because we would kind of end up rewriting Helm if we were just trying to pull in their Go packages. And this allows whoever's using Reckoner to determine what version of Helm they want to use as they release new features.
So Luke, hate to interrupt you real quick here, but you mentioned the fact that you support repositories. Something that I found really interesting, kind of just going through your docs before this. You guys can use GitHub repos as chart repositories as well, right? Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, definitely. This is a feature that was very, very useful as we develop our own charts, because we have charts that we manage in an open source way. And to test Helm charts, yes, you can do this. Locally, you pull down a branch, you run Helm install against the directory, and that's fine too. This is just, if you want to get a lot of people to test it, you can just say, put this in your course file. Your version then becomes either a Git hash or branch, and then Reckoner will do the Git clone, pull, and install via the directory part of Helm. So it is a nice little feature out of Helm for developing.
I love that, because if you just search GitHub and Helm, there's maybe 101 posts about how can people use their GitHub repos directly as a Helm chart repository, or to be able to kind of pull it into their CI/CD. So I feel like this is one of those neat little add-ons that actually ends up providing so much value to, like you mentioned, development use cases, but also kind of CI/CD.
Yeah, certainly. If you have charts that you don't necessarily want to need to make open source, like they're just from your internal Git, if you have a good tagging scheme, you can certainly just use this as your only deployment mechanism without having to have a chart repo.
Yeah.
Cool. You know what? Maybe we just jump right into the demo portion. I think we'll probably generate some more questions there. So let me go stop this share, and I will share my VS Code, and just let me know if that text looks big enough.
You can go a little bigger, but I can read it.
Sure. All right. Let's lower this a little.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, cool. So it always helps me to have a little bit more of a visual instead of just looking at docs. Always read your docs, but then try it out. That's my recommendation here. So go over a few of the features that I talked about, and here you go. Right here is setting up a Git repo as a Helm repository here. So these top level keys are probably the ones you'll need the most outside of, or these ones up here are important, but not always required. I think so. Namespace will just be your default if you don't define one in a given release. So you can define if you have an infra namespace. That's kind of how that works. And same thing with repository. I need to change this probably because that's an old idea. So let's put that there. All right, so namespace management, I talked about a little bit. We default to just saying, we're going to create the namespace if it doesn't exist. And we don't, by default, add anything, but we do allow you to define some default metadata if you want it on your namespaces and set it to overwrite. So if the namespaces already exist and you don't set overwrite to true, it won't actually put these things on there. But all right, so let's take a look here at metrics server. Now, well, first off, how about we just see what we have here in our command line. We'll come back to the course file. So there's a lot of commands here, and let me just verify I'm on the right version. Yes. So create namespace and default to true, like I mentioned. Now, right now, I don't have anything installed in this kind cluster. So everything seems to be running fine. So let's just give this a whirl. So Reckoner plot, and then you point out your course file, which I'm in this directory. It needs to be either the full path or relative path to your course file. -O is only. So I only want to install this chart or this release name, sorry. So you give your release name there, metrics server. This message will show up because this is actually our old version of our spec. So we did add a convert command to automatically take your course file and convert your course file for you. I can show what that would look like too. So we get our normal, like this is a normal Helm output of like a Helm install if you have like a help text in your chart. So let's take a look here. And I applied these Helm values. So these still have to be values that are defined in your Helm chart. You can't arbitrarily add things, but this is where you would define that. So,
but that gets rid of like the values file.
Yeah, it allows you to overwrite specific values that are defined in the chart chart values file. Exactly. Yep.
So you're muted.
Sorry. So in the subcharts, if there were actually values already being set, would those get overwritten then, or what takes precedence here?
Say that again. Sorry.
So if there were already values set in the subcharts, would this kind of override those values?
Yes, this is basically the same as running Helm install, with the -f and then pointing out a values file that had this data in it. Basically, if you just had your YAML in a separate file and ran Helm install with a -f.
So Luke, you brought up a good point that those variables, those values have to be available to get overridden. Now, say that the chart creator, when I'm writing out my course, I made a mistake. There's a typo somewhere. Is there like a test command that I can run to like validate the syntax, validate that kind of thing isn't going to happen before I actually run a plot?
So we have a reckoner. Let me see. We have a reckoner lint, but all it does is lint that your course file is valid. That's a great suggestion, though, that I think would be an awesome feature add if we could say, you're defining value ABC, but the chart only has value A and B. So I think that's a great idea, actually. It's
nice.
We have to open an issue here.
Yeah, I'll open an issue for that. There you go.
Yeah, good feature add.
I always say the best Containers from the Couch shows end up with a PR somewhere. So I think that's going to be one of those things we can figure out.
Absolutely. The other thing that I'll point out, since I am using a release client, that's kind of my my fallback if anything happens here that doesn't go well. If the demo guys are true, that's a release client. We'll fix it. Okay, so we talked about subcharts. So Goldilocks actually does have subcharts for VPA and metric server, actually. So they are required to be in the cluster for Goldilocks to work right. But by default, the chart doesn't actually enforce that unless you say install VPA is true and install metric server is true. So we're doing this ourselves. So we will just now run reckoner plot -a, which will just install everything. And actually, this is a good opportunity to do reckoner update. So reckoner update will actually check to make sure there's actually a diff that's going to happen and then install. If you just run reckoner plot, it will always run reckoner install --update and or update -- install and force that install even if nothing's changing. But if we run reckoner update, and this is a command I haven't run in a while, so we'll see if this release candidate is up to snuff.
And not to give away the future demo or something, but we could potentially run Nova on this to see if some of those are deprecated after, right? All right.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll jump into it pretty soon here, I think, with Nova. So Nova, I'll talk about it while this is running. Actually, right now we can see in the output that update available because we haven't installed these other things, but no update necessary for metric server, so it won't actually try to update it. And then it goes through and actually does the updates. But yeah, thank you for bringing up Nova. Nova is a CLI utility also that we use to determine when there's a newer version of a chart out there. Now that is surprisingly difficult to do sometimes in code because in the release artifact in your cluster, it does not tell you the repository that it came from. There is no link there. It's up to the chart maintainer to actually put that into the metadata of the chart file. So as we were working on this, we have this whole like scoring mechanism that scans Artifact Hub, does a search, and goes through each one to check to see what is the same and add a score to it. And it's interesting how it's difficult. And I do actually have my own HIP NPR open to Helm to add that to the release metadata. So we'll see. I need to get back to that. Actually, this is a good reminder for me to follow up on that. But okay, so we have all these things installed now, I hope. So we'll lower that just for a sec. We see we got everything kind of installed here. One thing I wanted to point out here is the Git use case here. Right now, we allow you to not put a version, and we will default to the master branch. But that we want to deprecate that and just totally get rid of it. So you have to give a version, because we don't like to assume what your branch is going to be. But it's to not change the way it worked before during this rewrite. So that is a thing to keep in mind if you start to use this in the future.
So just curious, is this like what version is this project at? Because I know that projects do that kind of thing a lot before they released a 1.0 version, where they'll kind of break actual behaviors that users might currently have. That's something I'd potentially be worried about if someone out there was just pulling straight from master. Don't get me wrong, of course that's the wrong approach, but I'm just kind of curious how you guys plan to handle that.
So what we'll do is we'll add in a deprecation notice if we see a Git repo that doesn't have a version set. In fact, let's see, that might be another issue to open before we actually get this release candidate to a full release. Because I think we want to start that with this major release. We want to say, you're installing from Git and you haven't specified a version, this feature will be removed in whatever version in the future. So that's going to be our plan for that. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So now the cool thing is I can also just go delete this, because now so I should point this out. When you define a repository here, it is simply a reference up to this section.
Right.
So Fairwinds stable is getting defined, and Fairwinds stable Git is defined separately, since even though it's the same place, it's just installing it a different way. So I changed that to Fairwinds stable. And then version, we see the current installed version of VPA is 1.2.2. I happened to look earlier and know that 1.3.0 is out. And so the other tricky thing with this, though, which is difficult to solve for, is if there are tests, like Helm tests, that are installed via hooks, that will always show up as a diff, which is tough to. I think we could do some work on that feature as a feature to kind of just ignore hooks as a diff. But so if I were to run Reckoner diff now, let's just try it on VPA. This message will essentially just always run if we scan and decide that it's not at V2. It'll give you a warning. So we see this stuff we expect to change. The metadata of service account VPA recommender is, of course, being updated. Scroll down to more interesting things. So service account, we see this as a hook. So I think we could do some work as a feature to ignore hooks. But for now, it's not the end of the world that they show up in here. But this is what the diff will look like when something is changing with your Helm installs using Reckoner. So
nice. So this is that diff, just to kind of validate this. It's only changing the VPA portion. I'm not sure if I saw that, and it's not going to mess with any of the other components that haven't changed, right?
Correct. So Reckoner diff, it's the command syntax is fairly similar no matter what command you use. So Reckoner, then an action, and then the course file, and then either -A or -O with a specified. And you can specify more than one -O if you want to install like 3 out of 5 things instead of all of them.
But if you define -A for everything, the only thing we've actually changed is VPA, but you might get hooks from the other thing showing up in that output.
Correct. So if I run reckoner diff, the output will be a lot, but this initial log file or the initial logging will kind of show what is changing, meaning these logs here. It'll say nothing is changing. But yeah, if there are hooks, it's kind of tough to account for that. Yeah.
Cool.
Is there a way to kind of establish dependencies? Say I had another component that was dependent on VPA. So if VPA gets updated, I would want to restart that component as well, that Helm chart as well. Is that something you would do with the chart, or would you try to configure that in the Helm chart itself?
I'm assuming you use hooks for that, right? If
Yeah,
you have hooks that are generic enough after an install, right? So you'd have to know that it's not declarative at that point because you're doing some sort of imperative like, hey, once this is going, I need this other version, or I need this thing to restart or clear a cache.
Yeah, we try not to do too much assuming on dependencies and rely on the users to kind of, you could use hooks like that, but like you said, it becomes a little more imperative at that point. So let's take a look here. This is another feature. We will parse your environment variables for things that are secret. I have a really, really secure password, I think, for my Redis install here. Yep, there it is. So it's the reason I did this though is A, to show off that you can do that, but also because the Redis chart will just generate you a password every time, so it'll always say it's changing if you don't do that. So
and that essentially, because that's still, oh yeah, it is a value. I saw the top level key now, values. So that is doing the same thing as adding a values file with your value in it, but it's doing all that parsing for you and then sending it to the chart. Cool.
Yep. There's a lot of trickiness in our YAML on marshalling to make that work. It was actually surprisingly difficult compared to the Python implementation. Doesn't seem like it should be that hard, but okay. So I think at this point, I've covered a lot of the interesting features here. We can see also in namespace, for instance, we can just actually, so we can see these labels and annotations were added to the namespaces as we went because we made this top level key here.
If you go in and if you unlabel that namespace and run a diff again, I'm assuming it'll detect that, hey, I need to add these labels back in, right?
Oh man, I'm going to.
You don't have to do it right now.
I'm going to
do it live.
Yeah, you know what? It's a release candidate. Throw my hands up in the air. We'll make an issue. Yeah. All right. We'll just do. We'll do Redis again because we were just looking at that. But yeah, it's always, we're always open to good feature requests as well. So we're not scary. We're very friendly. So feel free to open an issue or PR. All right, let's take a look at this namespace here. Looks like it did not. So the overwrite settings. This is another thing to point out, though. We also are not in the game of deleting your Helm releases. So there is no reckoner delete command because we feel like that is something that still like a human should probably think about a little bit more than just trying to automate all of it. So there is no reckoner delete. You would simply do your normal Helm delete and then remove it from your course file. Because of course, if you then run reckoner plot later against everything, it'll reinstall it. So maybe a good bug report here to update annotations and labels every time if it's relevant.
If overwrite's true, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so at this point, are there any reckoner burning questions right now? I might jump into Nova.
I think we're good on reckoner. If anyone else has questions, go ahead and ask in chat. But we could totally jump over to Nova now and see how that works with Helm charts inside the cluster that are already deployed.
Yeah, so exactly like that. It will jump in, it will scan your cluster for your Helm releases and then do some searching against Artifact Hub. Now, I will say there is a issue / feature we need to add probably for caching, because Artifact Hub does have rate limits, and we kind of use the search function pretty liberally in our code right now. But we'll try to limit how many times we run Nova at this point, just in case. But it's more of a problem on really large clusters with a lot of releases.
And the important question now is Nova in Python or Go?
Nova is Go, yes. And it was started from the ground up as Go. So that was another reason why we rewrote Reckoners, just because it was the only Python tool we had. It's probably one of our oldest open source tools, and then the newer ones were all written in Go from the start. So just to get everyone on the same kind of language, not having to switch back and forth too much within the company. Yeah. So okay. So Nova is a little bit more simpler. There's not as many commands. There's a find, and that is basically the only command that you need to worry about. And you can run it without too many arguments, and it will go and let you know what it finds. It's usually, well, I won't say anything. It's a demo. Okay, yeah, it's usually pretty quick. So we see we've installed the most recent version of basic demo. So it is not old and it's not deprecated. This deprecated field is also still reliant on that chart metadata. So a chart maintainer has to determine if it's deprecated. There's no other real way for that, but we like to report it here. I haven't yet found one that's ever said it was deprecated, but so we can see here, it tells you what your latest version is. So for Goldilocks, if I go in to my course file now, add that in, install that. Yeah, essentially the tricky part, I can talk a little bit about why it's so tricky to find the actual correct repository to check for a new version. It's because anybody can go fork a chart repo and make their own and not change any of the metadata. So if you just fork the Redis chart from Bitnami and only that one, you can, if you publish it to Artifact Hub, that will show up in our list of search, and we have to kind of score things based on the metadata. And to be honest, at the end of the day, one of the things we had to do was just add an extra scoring if it was one of these major chart providers like Bitnami, and we also prefer our own when we see one of our charts. So that's kind of how that scoring system works in the code.
So Luke, I kind of have a burning question here, and it's kind of about, we're talking about two different projects today, and I'm seeing you use both of them, and it seems like in a standard workflow, you probably will be using both Reckoner and Nova together. When do you decide to branch it off or break it apart into its own open source project? And could there potentially be, was there a decision made at some point where Nova could have been included as a part of Reckoner, but decided to pull it out into its own project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Nova from the start has been seen as a tool that we can probably use to check for new versions of multiple things. So not just Helm releases. And in fact, there's a draft PR that I just put up last week for scanning container images and letting you know when an actual container registry repository has a new version of a tag.
Compared to the chart, let's see, like actually, because even if my Redis chart is updated, the container still might have, need updates or something like that. And I have to wait for either the chart maintainer to publish a new version. I'm a maintainer of a Helm chart. I have not touched it for years. I do not know the state of that chart with the containers. I'm sure there are new versions available. So yeah, that's a big question of like, hey, I need to check different levels of updates here. Is the chart up to date or is the container up to date?
Exactly. Yeah. So the container scanning part is completely unrelated to Helm, but we do see Nova as being a tool going forward that could potentially check for new versions of just about anything. And especially since introducing the container registry aspect is actually maybe really relevant for the future of Helm too, as they start to have, I shouldn't say Helm, to Helm also, to use OCI registries as your repo which is I think now out of like beta or alpha or whatever it was.
Right.
In
So
Helm.
I think that kind of helped answer my question. So Nova is almost breaking into this security, vulnerability, compliance space. If putting on my AWS hat for a second here, I would probably want to combine some of the vulnerability scanning features that we have in ECR with something like Nova to not just check the images, but maybe potentially also check the chart versions as well. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think this is probably a good time to also go ahead and just take a look at Pluto, which I don't think it's not completely tied to Helm, but it is related if you run it into in a cluster.
I mean, to Sai's point too about integrating the two, like it would be cool actually just to have Reckoner have a find command that only looks at my deployment charts, right? Like, because Nova's looking at everything, but I don't necessarily always want to look at everything. Maybe I'm just working on this deployment that has a, if my cluster has 50 different Helm charts, I don't actually care. Like, I just want the one that I'm working on right now. And so it would be, I could see those going together really well and just having like, hey, Reckoner, find this, what's updated on this chart, and then I will decide if I want to update those too. But Nova has a lot more depth of like, I can scan everything more for an operator that's not working on a specific chart, but maybe needs to send notifications, or, hey, we see that, a CVE came out for this container. Is it running anywhere in our cluster? We have 1,000 containers. I don't know. And they need to be able to find that level of things too.
Yeah, exactly.
And Justin, I have a feeling, and Luke, we definitely want to give you a floor to talk about this, but, Fairwinds, they do so much great open source that, I've only really did a little bit of research today, but so many great projects you have out there. But there's a solution available as well. And I'd imagine that that's kind of where a lot of these tools kind of coalesce, plus additional capabilities to give a kind of all-inclusive experience, right?
Yeah, exactly. Fairwinds, we do offer a SaaS platform for Kubernetes operators that our open source is super important to us, and we want to provide these tools for people to use them. But we have this single, a popular term, single pane of glass, to kind of see everything in a cluster and across multiple clusters. So yes, Nova and Pluto specifically are used by our SaaS platform as well. So yeah, that's a good kind of segue, I think, to, let me make sure I have, that seems new enough. If we run Pluto, is it also fine? Oh, this is that Cobra thing where help and --help aren't the same. I have to go fix that. Or I might not have the newest version, to be honest. Okay, so detect. We maybe should start standardizing our commands too. Okay, so Pluto detect. Detect Helm. So detect that is actually surprisingly good. That just means that none of our API groups that we've installed so far are deprecated or being removed.
Just real quick on Pluto. Pluto's not looking at updates from charts. Pluto's looking at the API versions that the resources are using.
Sorry, yeah, I did not give any sort of intro to Pluto at all. It was born out of the 1.16 Kubernetes upgrades when a lot of those important API groups were being removed after being deprecated. So deployment and daemon set, I believe, were the biggest ones in that one. There were others, and then that's a common problem going forward too. We have been keeping it up to date. So right now, when you run Pluto, it defaults to assume you want to get to Kubernetes 1.22, and will tell you what things are going to be have been deprecated that you have in your cluster, deprecated at the time of 1.22 or before, and also what's going to be removed at 1.22 or before.
And deprecation goes both ways of alpha features being removed or graduated features that are removing older versions of the API. So those both situations, like you mentioned, daemon sets and deployments, those move to a new API that is graduated and stable, and you shouldn't use the beta alpha versions, which is where that deprecation, that like big warnings came out with 1.16.
Yeah. Yep. And so we keep that up to date as new versions are released, because it's surprisingly difficult to programmatically parse the release notes in Kubernetes. So always open to people if you find something that's like seems off or whatnot. We do our best, and we've had a lot of good community support in keeping that up to date. But yeah, always looking for help there when something seems a little weird that we report. So if you don't mind, I will do the last screen share swap to my browser.
Yep.
And okay, so I had this little project that I will increase the text of. Now this is my CI/CD. This is where Pluto can help with your CI/CD. So there is an orb in Circle CI. We're big users of Circle CI, but this will also work anywhere you want, as long as you can install the binary. So here's the important part. We check out, we install Helm. This is in the case that you have a Helm chart in your repo, but you aren't going to be scanning the cluster necessarily. We're just going to template out all the things that would get deployed and then detect that based on standard input from Pluto Detect. So, sorry, my dependent bot. I haven't updated this until 3 years ago until today. So, so if we go look here at my Circle CI, we can see.
So in this case, we're using Pluto in that before we deploy, saying, hey, we know this is going to break. We don't have those APIs anymore in the cluster, whatever cluster version we're trying to go to. Let's stop that at CD before it goes somewhere. So we can say like, hey, your Helm is generating this template. That YAML, don't do it anymore. That API is gone. So Pluto's helping you detect those things.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So Pluto can scan flat YAML files. You can pipe a Helm template clearly into standard out, and then it will scan against your standard output. Or you can run against your cluster if you use Helm to install. It will scan the Helm releases. I think I kind of forgot to mention the whole point that it has to exist is because kubectl will lie to you when you ask what a thing is. Like if you just say kubectl get pod, it's not necessarily telling you the version that you deployed at. It's returning. I don't necessarily think it's always the default version that the API server knows about, but it's the first version in the list in the code that is allowed for that resource type.
It'll also be whatever version you ask for, because you can ask for the version endpoints and it'll give you that version back. So if you deploy a beta 1 and you go ask for beta 2, it'll give you beta 2 and without actually telling you the original.
Yeah, so it's really the API server is very magical and will convert things on the fly, but that is not helpful when you're trying to look at things that have already been deployed. So that's kind of why Pluto has to exist, or why we make use of it, at least for during our upgrade stretches. So you can see that Pluto will exit with proper exit code because we designed it to be usable in CI/CD. So if there are none, it'll just return as 0. But we can see here that we have some cluster role and cluster role binding in my project here that are using an old version. Now, let's go take a look at this real quick. CI/CD. Yeah. So you can see here we document kind of what code to look for. This
go ahead and make that a little bigger too.
Oh, yep. So code 3 is what we exited with, and that just means if we are installing into a cluster that is planned to be upgraded to 1.22 or is already at 1.22, it will not actually deploy properly because this is a removed API version. If we get exit code 2, it's going to be deprecated some point before that 1.22 version. And we still exit code 2, but you can actually, if you only want to error on removed APIs, you can pass a flag to do that. So yeah, that's in a nutshell is Pluto. And it also probably needs some updating on Cert Manager CRDs, but we also support reporting when Cert Manager is they deprecate and remove API versions also. So depending on the version of Cert Manager you want to go to, you can scan that too. But I think there's a little work to be done on keeping that more up to date, because Kubernetes is the one that this was initially made for and our biggest concern. So yeah, I think are there any questions anyone has on any of this stuff?
No, and when I found Pluto last year, it was a huge help for me just to like know, oh, this is be able to scan the live cluster or my manifest files. I love that it has that CD component where you're just like, I actually just need to scan something. And actually self promotion shout out for a kube control plugin that I built called Detector for Docker Socket. There's a link. See it as a project. You can install it with kube control, and it also can be used inside of CI/CD. Where when I was seeing what Pluto was doing, to like, hey, exit one if I don't want to deploy this, basically. And so I added that functionality in too, because I'm like, yeah, that's actually really important. We want to block things before they cause a problem, and they get, if you're trying to replace like part of a chart and like you're, some role binding or something changes, but the rest of the deployment doesn't go out, like you're going to have a bad day. And so just block the whole thing first. And so with a Docker socket detector, like that's what I was also looking at doing, is like, yeah, just put this in CD, scan those files. And then if it detects that the Docker socket is being mounted and you're trying to go a Kubernetes cluster that doesn't have Docker running, you're going to be in for a bad day. So let's go ahead and block that early on. So yeah, it was a cool thing seeing like other tools allow you to do that. Just check all these manifests before we're going anywhere to make sure we're not going to break something.
Yeah.
That's really neat. Honestly, I think there's so many things in the Kubernetes ecosystem that are constantly changing. And yes, the API versions are one thing that can get deprecated in the Docker detector socket that got deprecated. It's almost like it'd be great if there was a project that brought all of these things together. And I almost could see Pluto as potentially expanding scope for something like that. I mean, maybe I should ask you that question. I know today it's for API versions specifically, but in the future, just to handle deprecations of commonly used features in general, do you see that as something that Pluto could potentially expand into?
I think our initial thought with Pluto is to stick to kind of even though we do support the cert manager, kind of the Unix philosophy of trying to be good at one thing, and then we tie it together elsewhere using the tool. So maybe there's another tool. Well, maybe we implement DDS here also in a tool chain. But you're right, it does get kind of expansive, and that's partially why it gets tough to find all the different tools to do all the things, which is partially why we made the offering of Insights, Fairwinds Insights too. So it's kind of your single area to work on that. So while we're talking about future, I know we're getting close on time, but Reckoner, a big feature add that I would be remiss if I didn't bring up. We're working on a design document now so that you can start to use Reckoner as your manager for GitOps workflows.
Oh, cool.
So the design would be maybe use Argo, and Reckoner will then, and the end result of this design will be Reckoner GitOps -- Argo or something, your course file, pull in all of your stuff, output all the YAML manifests in a opinionated directory structure, so that then when you commit that repo up, Argo takes over and actually does the GitOps thing on your flat YAML manifest. So it's like merging Helm. I know you can deploy things with Helm with Argo, but we have found that the PR system, seeing the diff of the actual YAML manifest, is super beneficial versus it's hard to know what's going to change with just a Helm release.
So it gives you that bridge from Helm to a full GitOps style. Cool.
Exactly. Yeah. And you still manage it all with the same course file layout if you're using Reckoner today. Yep.
Nice.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We saw some of people saying it was great. We loved learning about it. And where can people reach you if they want to, learn more or reach out or have suggestions?
Yeah. So of course, anywhere in our Git repos, you can make issues, PRs, but there's also links in there for our community Slack channel in all of our open source repos. So that's a great place to start. And if you just want to complain to me, maybe this is a bad idea, but you could tweet at me, localhost Luke, localhost _ Luke.
Cool.
But yeah, I was happy to be here, and thank you all.
Yeah, great to have you on, Luke. This is a very enlightening session for me too. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks. And anyone that's joining the show, thanks everyone for watching. Subscribe on YouTube. Sai's been putting out the Lightboard videos. I have some more shorts coming out this week. So if you've been enjoying any of my 1 minute explainers for things, I got more coming. And yeah, we'll catch you all next time. Bye.
See ya.